Oakcrest Drive was quiet in the small hours of the 14th of February 2000, with rain moving through Cleveland County in soft, uneasy sheets, and with the kind of winter wind that makes a porch light look more distant than it really is. You can picture the road as investigators would come to picture it later, not as a place from a headline, but as a familiar stretch of North Carolina pavement, lined with modest homes, open yards, dark trees, and the simple routines of families who knew one another well enough to wave from across the street. In that neighborhood north of Shelby, Asha Degree had gone to bed the night before as a fourth-grade girl with school ahead of her, family close by, and Valentine's candy still part of the ordinary sweetness of the weekend. Her name was pronounced I-Sure, and in the years that followed, people who never met her would learn to say it carefully, as though even the sound of it deserved to be handled with both accuracy and care. The early file begins in an almost domestic way, with a Sunday evening, a shared bedroom, a power outage, and parents checking on sleeping children in the dark. There had been a car accident nearby. The electricity had gone out for a time, and the house had fallen into that particular hush that comes when every appliance stops humming at once. When the power returned after midnight, Harold Degree looked in on Asha and her older brother O'Brien, and later, before he went to bed, he checked once more and saw both children where they were supposed to be. It was the kind of observation that seems ordinary when it happens, and then later becomes something a person repeats again and again, because the whole shape of the night depends on it. If you were sitting with the case file now, perhaps at a desk under a small lamp, you might pause over those times and let them settle without forcing them to answer too quickly. Sometime after that last check, Asha appears to have left the house, taking her book bag and some belongings with her, and stepping from the warmth of the family home into a wet February morning before sunrise. There was no sign of forced entry, no clear evidence that someone had come inside, and no simple explanation waiting in the hallway or beside the door. The first reason the case began to cool, even as the search was still warm with effort, was that the beginning itself was hard to understand. Asha was 9 years old, and by every public account from her family, she was not a child known for wandering, testing limits, or slipping outside alone. She was described as cautious, close to her family, involved in church and school, and frightened of dogs, which mattered because dogs lived along country roads and in rural edges where a child walking alone might hear barking from the dark. Investigators could ask, as you might ask while turning a page, why a child like that would leave in rain and wind before dawn, carrying a bag into a world she had been taught to treat carefully. But an investigation can't move forward on a question alone, even when the question is sincere and deeply human. The weekend before she vanished offered details, though not the kind that easily formed a map. Asha had played basketball, and her team had lost after a season of winning, and she had fouled out, which hurt her in the way small public disappointments can hurt a serious child. Her family said she had been upset, but they also said she seemed to recover, and by Sunday she had gone to church, spent time with relatives, and returned home as part of an ordinary family day. This is one of those details that investigators had to hold gently, because it might mean something or it might mean almost nothing at all, and patient detective work often begins by refusing to pretend that every sadness is a clue. So the first hours asked for two different kinds of patience, one practical and one emotional. The practical patients belonged to the deputies, neighbors, searchers, and family members who had to move quickly through rain-soft ground, roadside ditches, yards and nearby woods, trying to locate a child before time could widen the distance. The emotional patience belonged to everyone who had to sit with the impossible ordinariness of the night before when a child was asleep in her bed, and the morning after when her mother opened the bedroom door and found only one child there. A case can go cold, not because nobody cares, but because care itself cannot manufacture a witness, a confession, a clear trail, or the one missing piece that would let the next step appear. By the time Aquila Degree went to wake her children for school, the day had already taken its quiet, irreversible turn. She expected the routines of a Monday morning, the bathwater, the clothes, the small hurry of getting ready, and instead she found that Asha and her book bag were gone. The family looked inside the home, checked the cars, called nearby relatives, and then the police were contacted, while the early morning in Cleveland County kept unfolding as though it had no knowledge of what had changed. You can imagine how quickly a familiar house becomes strange when one room contains an absence, and every ordinary object begins to look like it might be waiting to explain something. The first search was not indifferent or slow in the emotional sense. It was immediate, worried, and joined by people who understood that a child was missing. Officers and volunteers searched near the home and along the possible route, while dogs were brought in and information began moving through a community where many people knew the Degree family, or knew someone who did. But the dogs did not produce the kind of clear scent trail that might have guided searchers steadily forward, and the weather had already been at work on the ground, the road, and whatever traces might have been there. Rain is not dramatic when it appears in a case file, yet it can be one of the quiet ways time begins erasing itself. Then came the road sightings, and they remain among the most important early details, partly because they offered confirmation and partly because they deepened the mystery. Motorists later reported seeing a young girl walking along North Carolina Highway 18 in the early morning darkness, not far from Asha's home, and the descriptions were consistent enough that investigators believed they were likely seeing her. One person reportedly turned around to check on the girl, concerned that a child would be out alone at that hour, and the girl moved away from the road and disappeared toward the trees. It is a detail that has stayed in the public memory because it feels so close to an answer, and yet it leaves you standing at the edge of the woods with nothing more solid than a direction. That moment on Highway 18 is often where the mind wants to hurry, because it seems to promise movement, decision, and a reason hiding somewhere just beyond the headlights. But in a calm review, you have to slow down and remember that the witnesses came forward after news of Asha's disappearance had begun to spread, and that memory under such conditions can be sincere without being perfectly complete. Investigators had to compare times, clothing descriptions, locations, and the conditions of the road, while also accepting that no one who saw the child understood, in that instant, that they might be seeing the last confirmed trace of her. The case went cold, in part because the most important sightings were brief, passing, and recognized fully only after the road had gone quiet again. There is a particular loneliness in roadside evidence because a road is made for passing through rather than staying still. A car approaches, headlights widen across the shoulder, a figure appears for a few seconds, and then distance closes over the view as naturally as water returning to its level. A driver may remember a white shirt, small shoulders, rain, or the oddness of the hour. But memory is not a camera, and in those first reports there was no license plate, no companion, no destination, and no clear explanation for why Asha was walking there. Investigators were left with a real sighting that did not yet become a path, and that is one of the gentlest but hardest truths in old cases. The roadside also created a difficult question about agency, which is just a careful way of asking what Asha meant to do when she left home. If she packed her book bag and walked out on her own, then investigators needed to know why, and whether someone had persuaded her, planned with her, or waited for her somewhere beyond the house. If she left for a child's private reason, something small or imagined or misunderstood, then the investigation had to consider what happened after she reached the highway, when the world became larger than whatever plan she may have carried. Either way, the fact that she appears to have left without being taken from inside the home made the case harder to classify, harder to explain, and harder to solve quickly. In the first days, searchers looked for signs that might turn uncertainty into sequence. They searched near the road, near the place where a witness said the girl had gone into the wooded area, and around nearby properties where a child might have sheltered from rain. Some items connected to Asha were later found in or near a shed at a local upholstery business, including small belongings that seemed to place her along that route, but those items did not answer the larger question. They suggested presence, perhaps a pause, perhaps a moment of shelter or confusion, yet they did not tell investigators who else might have been there, or where she went afterward. You can imagine an investigator standing in such a place during those early days, looking at the ground not as scenery, but as a surface that might still hold meaning. A shed, a tractor, a doorway, wrappers, a pencil, a marker, a hair bow, the kinds of small objects that belong more naturally to a child's school life than to an adult investigation. Each item must be photographed, collected, logged, and considered, but none of them can be made to speak beyond what they are able to say. The investigator's patience begins there, in accepting that evidence has limits, and that the smallest things can matter without being enough. At the time, the working possibilities remained open, and that openness was necessary, though painful. Investigators had to consider whether Asha had run away, whether she had been lured, whether she had set out for a destination known only to her, whether something had happened along the highway, or whether someone had intercepted her in the quiet hours before dawn. The problem was not a lack of theories, but the lack of a single strong piece of evidence that could make one theory responsible for the next investigative step. A case can go cold when there are too many doors and too few keys, and every door looks as though it might open onto a different version of the same morning. The family's account also made the runaway explanation feel incomplete, and this mattered to detectives who were trying to build the case from behavior as well as physical evidence. Asha did not fit the usual image of a child preparing to leave home for long, and there was no public evidence of trouble at home, no pattern of disappearance, and no known conflict that explained walking into the weather before sunrise. Yet the bag was gone, and some clothing was missing, and that suggested at least some kind of preparation, even if the preparation was childish, partial, or shaped by an idea adults could not recover. The contradiction sat quietly at the center of the file, and contradictions are often where cold cases begin to gather dust. There is no need to make that contradiction frightening in order to feel its weight. It is enough to picture a child's book bag, packed not like an adult suitcase but like a child's understanding of leaving, with items chosen because they felt important in the moment. It is enough to picture parents trying to remember whether anything had been unusual, whether a sentence, a mood, a small hesitation, or an ordinary Sunday detail had changed meaning overnight. In the patient work of old investigations, people return to such memories again and again, not because they enjoy pain, but because memory is sometimes the only place left to search. The first week brought an enormous amount of effort, though effort and progress are not always the same thing. Searchers covered miles, checked properties, followed tips, and distributed flyers, while law enforcement gathered reports from people who thought they had seen something, heard something, or remembered something that might matter. Some leads would have required careful checking even if they seemed unlikely, because missing child cases do not allow investigators the luxury of ignoring possibilities too soon. But after days of work, and after many hours invested by officials and volunteers, there was still no Asha, no clear suspect, and no known destination. This is one of the reasons the case became so enduring, because it was not abandoned at the beginning. It was searched, discussed, televised, prayed over, and carried by a community that did not want to let it fade, and still the central answer did not come. That kind of failure can be misunderstood from the outside, as though a cold case always means someone stopped caring, when often it means the opposite, that people cared intensely and repeatedly, and still could not force the facts to arrange themselves. The file cools not from lack of warmth, but from the slow loss of movement. In the days after Asha disappeared, investigators had to separate helpful information from noise, which is one of the quiet, exhausting tasks of any large search. A person might report a child in another town, a vehicle in the wrong place, an abandoned building that seemed worth checking, or a rumor that had passed through several mouths before reaching police. Each lead takes time, and time is not only a clock in an investigation, but a corridor that grows longer with every false turn. When those early leads failed to locate Asha or identify a person responsible, the case began to change from an urgent search into a long inquiry, though for her family, the urgency never truly ended. Asha's disappearance also happened at a moment when forensic tools were useful, but not yet what they would become in the decades that followed. In 2000, investigators could collect evidence, preserve items, compare fingerprints, test certain materials, and send important pieces to laboratories. But the later world of advanced DNA recovery, genetic genealogy, large searchable databases, and digitized case management was still developing. What could not be interpreted then might have to wait, sealed in evidence packaging, for science and technique to catch up. Cold cases often depend on that kind of waiting, where an item in a box is not forgotten, but is simply not yet ready to tell all it may know. The public sometimes imagines evidence rooms as dusty places, where answers sleep in plain sight, but the reality is usually more modest and more demanding. A bag must be labeled correctly, chain of custody must be protected, reports must be written clearly, and future investigators must be able to understand what was done before they arrived. A cold case is not just a mystery, it is also an archive. And archives require patience because the smallest mistake in preservation can make tomorrow's test less useful. In Asha's case, the evidence that remained would become important many years later, but in the early weeks it still did not point clearly enough to one person, one vehicle, or one motive. The emotional atmosphere of the case was shaped by Valentine's Day, though not in any dramatic way, and certainly not as a symbol to be forced. It was also Harold and Asha Degree's wedding anniversary, a date that should have belonged to family memory in a different form. After Asha disappeared, the calendar itself became part of the repetition year after year, as the date returned with flowers in stores, school routines, winter weather, and the same unanswered question. Families of missing people often live with that kind of doubling, where an ordinary date remains ordinary for everyone else, while for them, it opens quietly into the same morning again. In Shelby and the surrounding county, Asha became known as Shelby's sweetheart, a phrase that may sound simple from a distance, but reflected a community's continued attachment to a child who had been missing for years. Her photograph appeared on posters, billboards, age-progressed images, and news segments, each one asking people to look again, remember again, and consider whether some small piece of information had been held back or overlooked. Such public reminders matter because cold cases are kept alive not only by detectives at desks, but by communities that refuse to let a name vanish into paperwork. Yet, awareness is not the same as resolution, and even a widely recognized face can remain beyond reach. The most haunting object in the case, though, would not be found during that first week. More than a year later, in August of 2001, Asha's book bag was discovered along Highway 18 near Morganton, roughly 30 miles north of the place where she had last been seen. It had been wrapped in black plastic bags and found during construction work, a discovery that reopened the case in a new direction while also bringing a deep and quiet frustration. A child's book bag should be near a desk, a coat hook, a bedroom floor, or the back seat of a family car, and when it appears far from home, wrapped and hidden, it becomes an object full of questions. That discovery mattered because it confirmed that part of Asha's belongings had traveled away from the original search area, but it did not bring investigators directly to her. The bag was sent for examination, and its contents were studied, preserved, and guarded with the seriousness they deserved. Over time, investigators would publicly discuss some items found with it, including a children's book from her school library and a new Kids on the Block shirt that her family said did not belong to her. Those items were important because they might have touched another household, another child, another adult, or another memory. But for many years, they did not produce the answer everyone needed. You can sit with that book bag for a while, in the quiet way old evidence asks to be considered. It had Asha's name connected to it, and it had been separated from her, carried or placed somewhere that searchers would not find until construction work disturbed the ground. Someone might have known why it was there, and someone might have known how those unfamiliar items came to be inside it. But knowledge held privately does not help an investigation, unless it is spoken, discovered, or proven through evidence. The bag gave detectives a significant clue, but it also showed how much of the story had moved beyond sight. The distance between Shelby and Morganton became another quiet problem in the case. A child walking before dawn could not easily account for that distance alone, and so the book bag suggested the involvement of someone or something beyond Asha's own movements. Yet a direction is not the same as an identity, and a discovery site is not necessarily the place where an event occurred. Investigators had to ask whether the bag had been hidden soon after Asha vanished, or later, whether the person who placed it there was local, whether the route had meaning, and whether the wrapping was meant to preserve, conceal, discard, or delay discovery. Each question was reasonable, and none was simple. This is another way a case grows cold. Evidence can expand the mystery instead of narrowing it. The book bag did not contradict the highway sightings, and it did not undo the early search, but it added another location, another timeline, and another set of possible movements to a case already difficult to understand. Detectives could not assume that the person who had the bag was the same person who first encountered Asha, though they had to consider that possibility carefully. They could not assume that every item inside it belonged to the same moment, though each item might still matter. In patient detective work, even a major discovery can lead not to a door opening, but to a hallway with several turns. For the Degree family, the years after that discovery were not empty years, though they were years without the answer they most wanted. They kept Asha's name in public view, participated in annual walks, spoke to reporters, and held to hope in the face of uncertainty that would have exhausted many people beyond words. Their persistence became part of the investigation's life, because a family's refusal to let silence settle completely can keep a case visible long enough for new techniques, new witnesses, or new courage to arrive. The human element of this case is not only grief, it is endurance, repeated gently and publicly, long after the first news trucks moved on. There is a phrase often used in old missing person cases, that someone knows something, and in Asha's case it has been said many times because the circumstances seem to require it. A 9-year-old did not simply dissolve into rain, and a book bag did not carry itself 30 miles and wrap itself for concealment. Yet knowing that someone may have information is not the same as knowing who that person is, or what they know, or whether they understand the importance of a detail they once dismissed. Cold cases depend on the possibility that memory can change, conscience can shift, relationships can loosen, and a person who was once silent might one day speak. Investigators also had to live with the limits of early assumptions. At first, because Asha appeared to have left home voluntarily, some of the investigative frame leaned toward a runaway scenario, though investigators and experts quickly noted that she did not fit the usual pattern. That uncertainty mattered, because the way a case is understood at the beginning can shape searches, interviews, media language, and public attention, even when officers are working hard and in good faith. If a child is thought to have left on her own, some people may listen differently than they would if they believed she was immediately abducted. The file did not go cold because of one mistake, but because ambiguity is a slow fog that can settle across many careful efforts. And then there was the matter of public attention, which Asha's mother has spoken about with painful honesty. Missing children do not always receive the same level of national coverage, and families of black children have often had to work harder to keep their loved ones visible in a media environment that has not treated every disappearance equally. That disparity is not a theory inside the case, so much as a wider social fact pressing against it, shaping how long strangers remember a name, how often a photograph is shown, and how quickly a story is allowed to fade from national view. When a case cools, it can cool in public memory as well as in investigative files, and both kinds of cooling matter. Still, locally, Asha's case did not vanish. Detectives continued to take leads. The Cleveland County Sheriff's Office remained involved, the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation assisted, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation would later join renewed efforts in a deeper, more organized way. In 2015, agencies began a more comprehensive re-examination, reviewing old files, re-interviewing witnesses, and bringing the case into a more modern investigative structure. That kind of return is not glamorous, despite how it may sound from the outside. It means reading old reports, checking old names, comparing statements, and asking whether something overlooked then might have a new shape now. Imagine being the detective who comes back to a case after years have passed. Some witnesses have moved, some memories have softened, some people have died, and some records may exist in formats that feel older than the questions they contain. You are not starting at the beginning exactly, but neither are you free from the beginning, because every early decision, every early note, and every early uncertainty still matters. You have to respect the work done before you, while also being willing to see it differently, which is one of the quiet disciplines of cold case investigation. It asks for humility as much as skill. By the time Detective Tim Adams came out of retirement to work on Asha's case, the file had become more than a single investigation. It had become a community memory and a personal burden for many who had touched it. The renewed team included local investigators, state agents, and federal agents who could bring additional resources, analytical tools, and experience with long-term missing child cases. They organized records, reviewed leads, and tried to turn years of paper into something searchable, something that could reveal patterns hidden by time and volume. This is patient work at its most literal, the slow conversion of old pages into new possibility. One of the later public leads involved a vehicle described by authorities as a dark green early 1970s model, possibly a Lincoln Continental Mark IV or Ford Thunderbird, with rust around the wheel wells. Investigators said Asha may have been seen getting into such a car, or being taken into it, along the general area connected to her last known movements. The vehicle lead was released years after the disappearance, which meant that anyone who remembered such a car had to reach back across time, across owners, repairs, junkyards, family stories, and the ordinary disappearance of old automobiles from everyday roads. A car can be a strong clue, but after many years it can also become a ghost of metal and memory. That vehicle detail shows another reason the case remained difficult. If the information existed earlier in some form but was not publicly emphasized until later, then investigators had to hope that memory in the community could survive the delay. People might remember a green car from a neighbor's yard, a relative's driveway, a field behind a house, or a vehicle sold long ago for parts, but they might not have known it mattered until the public appeal came. In cold cases, timing is a fragile thing, because the right question asked years later may still produce an answer, but it asks memory to do work it was never warned it would need to do. The items from the book bag also returned to public attention in later years, especially the library book and the concert shirt. Investigators released images in the hope that someone might remember seeing the shirt, lending the book, finding the book, borrowing it from Falston Elementary, or noticing how those objects moved from one place to another. These were not dramatic clues in the loud sense. They were domestic, ordinary, almost gentle objects, the kind that passed through classrooms, laundry baskets, bedrooms, and church youth rooms without much notice. But cold case work often depends on ordinary things becoming meaningful later, once someone understands that a small memory can belong to a much larger question. The book, McElligot's Pool, carried its own quiet route through the case because it was associated with Asha's school library, though her family said it was not known as her personal property. A school library book can pass from shelf to hand, to backpack to classroom and back again, and in the ordinary life of a school, that movement is not suspicious at all. Years later, however, investigators had to ask whether its presence in the book bag reflected Asha's own choices, another child's belongings, a mix-up, or contact with someone who had access to school materials. The question is not loud, but it is persistent, and persistence is the heartbeat of this kind of inquiry. The shirt, with new kids on the block connected to it, belonged to a different kind of memory, perhaps one of music, older siblings, closets, hand-me-downs, concerts, or donated clothing. It may have been common enough that many people had something like it, and uncommon enough that someone, somewhere, might recognize the exact image. Investigators released it not because an object alone can solve a case, but because an object can wake a human memory that has been sleeping unnoticed for years. A person might say, "I remember that shirt," or "I remember a bag," or "I remember someone having something that didn't belong to them." And from that modest beginning, a colder file can sometimes warm again. But for many years, those objects did not publicly lead to resolution. That does not mean they were useless, and it does not mean investigators had no reason to preserve them. It means only that the path from object to answer can be long and indirect, especially when the object has passed through unknown hands or been exposed to unknown environments. Evidence may contain traces that were not yet detectable, or traces that were detectable but not yet meaningful, or traces that only become meaningful once other information arrives. In that sense, the case did not go cold because the evidence had nothing to say. It went cold because the evidence spoke in a language investigators could not yet fully translate. As the years moved on, Asha's age-progressed images became another part of the search. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children created images showing how she might have looked as an adult, not as certainty, but as a tool for recognition and hope. Such images are careful approximations shaped from photographs, family features, and trained artistic judgment, and they ask the public to imagine continuity where the record has been interrupted. They are tender things in a way, because they acknowledge time passing while refusing to let the missing person remain frozen only at the age they disappeared. In Asha's case, every new image carried both hope and the quiet ache of years. The annual walks held by her family and supporters also became a form of patient witness. People walked along the route connected to Asha's last known movements, retracing distance not to solve it with their steps, but to remember that the distance belonged to a real child and a real family. A walk is a simple act, but repeated over years, it becomes a kind of public promise, a way of saying that the road will not be allowed to keep its silence unchallenged. Investigators work with files and evidence, but families often work with ritual, and both can be ways of keeping a name present. By the time the case reached its second decade, its coldness had layers. There was the coldness of the physical trail, long since disturbed by weather, traffic, construction, and the natural changes of land and road. There was the coldness of memory, as witnesses aged and early impressions became harder to separate from later news coverage. There was the coldness of technology waiting to mature, and the coldness of public attention rising and falling in anniversaries rather than staying constant. Yet beneath all of that, there was also a steady warmth from the people who kept working, and this is why Asha's case never became merely an old story. To understand why it went cold, you have to hold both truths at once. The case went cold because the first known movements were strange, because the evidence was sparse, because the weather and the road gave little back, because witnesses saw only fragments, because the book bag appeared far away and much too late, because possible clues were ordinary objects with unclear histories, and because no single early lead broke open into certainty. But the case did not go cold because it lacked love, effort, or attention from those closest to it. That difference matters, and it is worth saying softly. In a quiet study, with the papers spread out before you, the first chapter of the case feels like a set of rooms connected by dim hallways. In one room, a family checks on sleeping children during a power outage. In another, a girl walks along Highway 18 in rain before dawn. In another, searchers look through roadside spaces. And in another, a book bag waits far from home until a construction worker uncovers it. The rooms are real, but the hallways between them are incomplete, and the work of detectives has been to find the missing corridors without inventing them. That is the discipline of a case like Asha Degree's. You do not rush to fill silence with certainty, because certainty that arrives too early can become another obstacle. You look at the weather, the road, the sightings, the family statements, the items in the shed, the book bag, the unfamiliar objects, the later vehicle lead, the renewed forensic work, and the long persistence of investigators who kept returning to the same unanswered morning. You let each detail stay proportionate, neither ignored nor exaggerated, and you remember that behind every evidence label is a child who had a life before she became a case. The night itself, when described plainly, remains difficult enough. A 9-year-old girl left her home before dawn on Valentine's Day, in rain and wind, and was seen walking along a highway before she vanished. That is the central fact, and it does not require embellishment. Around it, detectives built searches, families built hope, agencies built renewed teams, and time built its slow, complicated walls. Some walls are made of missing evidence, some of delayed recognition, some of ordinary forgetfulness, and some of silence that may belong to people who still know more than they have said. As you turn the next page of the file, the tone changes only slightly, not into drama, but into the slower rhythm of years. The first days belong to search parties and roadside questions, while the later years belong to evidence rooms, anniversaries, new technology, and detectives reading old notes with older eyes. The case did not become cold all at once. It cooled the way a room cools after the fire has burned down, with warmth still held in certain places, if you know where to touch. And in Asha's case, those warm places were the family, the investigators who returned, the community that kept walking, and the evidence that waited quietly for the future to become more capable than the past. Somewhere in that space between the past and the present, the file became less like a single folder and more like a room, with shelves, boxes, maps, photographs, lab reports, and names that had been checked and checked again. You can imagine entering that room quietly, not to disturb anything, and letting your eyes move over the labels in the soft order that investigators learn by practice. There are early interviews, later interviews, tips from strangers, notes from family members, property searches, forensic requests, and the steady return of one question that has never stopped asking for an answer. The question is simple only when spoken from a distance, because it asks why Asha left, where she was going, and who encountered her after the road. But inside the investigation, those questions divide into many smaller ones, each with its own stubborn edges and its own need for proof. What time did she leave the house? What did she carry? What had she packed earlier? What did she believe would happen next? And did anyone else know her plan before she stepped into the rain? The file cools because each answer requires another answer behind it, and because the first answer was never found cleanly enough to guide all the others. It is easy, years later, to imagine that a single missed moment explains everything. But old investigations are rarely that tidy when you sit with them patiently. A missed turn, a delayed call, an unnoticed vehicle, a witness who did not know what they were seeing, and an object that looked ordinary until much later can all become part of the same quiet difficulty. No one detail has to carry the whole weight of the case for the case to become hard. Instead, the hardness gathers slowly, like dust on the edge of a desk, while people continue working beneath it. There were many tips, and that fact can sound hopeful, though it can also become one of the ways a case grows complicated. A tip may be sincere and still wrong, vivid and still mistaken, confident and still shaped by later memory, especially when a child's face has appeared on television, flyers, billboards, and news pages for years. Investigators had to listen to people who wanted to help, then place those stories beside the timeline, the road, the weather, the known locations, and what evidence could still be tested. That is not glamorous work, but it is the careful sorting without which no cold case can survive. Some leads required travel, some required phone calls, some required interviews with people whose names had surfaced for reasons that turned out to be weak or coincidental. A person might have owned an old green car, known the route, lived near the road, worked near Morganton, or simply seemed unusual to someone who had grown uneasy with memory. Investigators could not ignore such things, but they also could not let suspicion replace evidence, because a cold case can be damaged by certainty that arrives without support. So they checked, and checked again, while the public saw only the silence between announcements. That silence is one of the hardest parts to understand from the outside. When nothing is being said, it can look as though nothing is being done. Though behind the quiet there may be lab requests, interviews, warrants, reviews, and conversations that cannot be shared without weakening the investigation. Families live inside that silence differently than the public does, because every quiet month is also a month of birthdays, school years, holidays, and ordinary meals with one place changed forever. The investigators live inside it too, in their own way, carrying a file that asks for patience long after the early urgency has left the headlines. The landscape itself changed while the case remained open. Roads were repaired, properties changed hands, cars were sold, buildings were renovated or removed, and people who once knew every neighbor along a stretch of highway moved elsewhere or grew older. A ditch where someone searched in 2000 might not look the same 15 years later, and a wooded edge remembered by a witness might be altered by development, weather, or the simple growth of trees. Time does not only pass over a case, it rearranges the physical world around it. That rearranging makes the old map less certain with every year. And yet, the map still matters. Highway 18 remains more than a line between towns, because in this case, it is the place where the known world and the unknown world meet. Oakcrest Drive, the roadside sightings, the area near the upholstery shed, and the later discovery of the book bag all belong to a geography that investigators have returned to again and again. You might trace those points with your finger across a printed map, slowly, without expecting the line to explain itself. The line is there, but the missing portion is exactly what the case has been trying to recover. The weather from that morning also remains in the file, not as drama, but as a practical condition that shaped what could be seen and what could be preserved. Rain can blur footprints, soften shoulders of roads, change how far headlights reach, and make a small figure on a highway both more noticeable and less clearly understood. Wind can carry sound away from houses, and darkness before sunrise can turn distance into guesswork. Investigators could collect what was still available, but they could not return the morning to a dry and bright version of itself. The evidence had to be found inside the weather that actually existed. When dogs were brought into a search, they were being asked to read a world already disturbed by rain, vehicles, searches, and time. A scent trail, if one existed, might have been weakened or confused, and the absence of a strong result could not be made to mean more than it fairly meant. This is another patient lesson in investigative work, that a tool can be useful without being magical, and that failure to find something is not always proof that it was never there. In a case with so few fixed points, even the limits of a search became part of the record. The early items found near the shed asked for the same restraint. They could suggest that Asha had been near that place, or that objects connected to her had arrived there, but they did not by themselves explain why she went there or what happened next. A hair bow, a pencil, a marker, and other small traces can feel intimate because they belong to the ordinary world of a child, yet intimacy is not the same as clarity. Detectives had to honor the importance of such items without letting their tenderness become a conclusion. That balance is one of the quiet skills of cold case work. The book bag, found later and farther away, carried a different kind of weight. It had been hidden carefully enough that it was not found by early searching, and it appeared in a place that suggested movement beyond what a child could reasonably have managed alone before school. But even that powerful discovery did not bring the case to a close, because an object can prove travel without proving who carried it, and it can imply concealment without naming the person who concealed it. The bag was evidence, but it was also a message written in a language without a signature. Inside that bag, the unfamiliar items became their own quiet puzzle. The school library book and the old band shirt might have arrived there innocently, accidentally, or through contact that mattered deeply, and investigators could not treat any one explanation as certain without more support. People were asked to remember whether they had seen those items, whether the book had passed through their hands, whether a shirt like that had lived in a closet or laundry room long ago. Such questions may sound small, but cold cases often turn on small remembered things. A shirt, a book, a borrowed object, and the timing of its journey can matter. Still, after many years, memory becomes a difficult witness. A person may remember owning a similar shirt, but not the exact one, or seeing a similar book, but not whether it was that copy. Children who once shared classrooms become adults. Adults move houses. School records change, and the ordinary traffic of objects through homes and schools becomes harder to reconstruct. The investigators' hope was that one detail might still stand out clearly in someone's mind, perhaps because it was out of place, or because it belonged to a moment that never quite settled. But hope in an investigation must wait for confirmation. The vehicle lead carried the same mixture of possibility and difficulty. A dark green car from the early 1970s, possibly a Lincoln Continental Mark IV or a Ford Thunderbird, with rust near the wheel wells, is specific enough to matter and old enough to blur with time. Many people might have known such a car in passing, and many such cars might have disappeared into barns, scrapyards, backlots, or family stories before investigators asked the public to think about them. When the appeal came, it asked a community to search not only the road, but the old garages of memory. Cars have their own quiet histories, and those histories can be hard to follow after decades. Titles are transferred, parts are removed, vehicles are repainted, registrations lapse, and a car, once noticed by everyone on a rural road, can become a stripped frame behind a building. Someone may remember the sound of a heavy door, the length of a hood, the color under porch light, or the way rust curved around a wheel well, but they may not remember a name. Investigators had to treat the vehicle as a possible bridge, while accepting that the bridge might have missing boards. The trail remained uneven. This is why a case can receive a public lead years later and still remain unsolved. The public may hear the announcement and feel that the answer must be near, but investigators know that a lead is only the beginning of another patient cycle. They must identify possible vehicles, owners, dates, addresses, alibis, repairs, and relationships, then compare each path against what is known from the night Asha disappeared. Many possibilities will narrow and then stop, while a few may remain open because the records are incomplete or the people involved can no longer answer. The work continues, but it continues slowly. The long wait also changed the available science. Techniques for recovering and analyzing trace evidence improved, and databases grew larger, while cold case units across the country learned how evidence once considered limited might become more useful under new methods. But forensic science is still bound by what was collected, how it was preserved, and what survived time, handling, weather, and storage. A sealed item can be precious, but it is not guaranteed to contain a clear biological profile, a usable print, or a trace that points to one person. Science can open doors, yet it cannot create evidence from absence. In later years, as agencies renewed their work, the case took on the slow rhythm of re-examination. Investigators revisited people, places, statements, and physical evidence, sometimes asking questions that had been asked before, but in a different way or with new information held behind the question. A witness may hear a familiar question and suddenly understand why an old detail matters, or may correct something that seemed small at the time. Cold case interviews are not only about catching someone in a contradiction, they are also about giving memory another quiet chance to surface. The family's role in this long rhythm cannot be separated from the case. Harold and Asha Degree continued to speak about their daughter, not as an abstract missing child, but as Asha, the girl who loved her family, went to school, played basketball, attended church, and belonged to a home that still held her memory. Their persistence kept the case human, when time might have turned it into a puzzle for strangers. Every year they reminded people that the file had a face, a voice, a favorite life before the disappearance, and a family still waiting with extraordinary steadiness. For listeners drifting through this story in the quiet, it may help to understand that waiting is not passive in such a case. Waiting can mean answering the phone when another tip arrives, attending another anniversary event, speaking to another reporter, trusting another detective, and opening yourself again to hope that may or may not bring news. Waiting can mean keeping photographs, preserving a bedroom memory, walking a road, or correcting the public record when people forget the living child behind the mystery. In that sense, the Degree family's waiting has been an active, loving form of searching. The community's waiting has been different, but it too has mattered. People in Cleveland County have grown up with Asha's photograph, with a roadside billboard, with annual reminders, and with the knowledge that this case belongs not only to police files, but to local conscience. Some people were children when she vanished and became adults, while the case stayed open, carrying with them a story they did not fully understand at the time. A cold case lives in that kind of shared memory, where the old question is passed quietly from one generation of neighbors to the next. It becomes part of a place's history. Yet shared memory can also be fragile. Rumor enters where evidence is missing, and people sometimes fill gaps with certainty because uncertainty is uncomfortable. Investigators have had to manage public speculation, private suspicion, and the natural human desire to make a story complete, even when the real file remains incomplete. This is one more reason the case went cold. Not because there were no stories, but because there were too many stories that could not be proven. Patient work requires setting aside the unverified even when it seems persuasive, and returning to what can still be checked. The restraint matters especially in Asha's case, because the mystery begins with a child's unexplained choice, or what appears to be a choice made under circumstances adults still cannot understand. It would be easy to invent a reason, to imagine a secret plan, a meeting, a fear, a misunderstanding, or a promise, but invention does not help her. The only responsible way forward is to keep each possibility open in proportion to the evidence, while remembering that a child's inner world can be complex without being fully visible to adults. The beginning remains quiet, and the quiet beginning remains central. If someone did lure her, investigators have had to ask how that contact happened. Was it through someone she knew, Someone she trusted indirectly? Someone connected to school, church, sports, family circles, or the neighborhood, or through some circumstance that left little trace in the public record? In the world before smartphones were common, before children's digital lives could leave streams of messages and locations, contact could be harder to reconstruct after the fact. The investigation had to search through human relationships, not a neat archive of texts or apps. That older world left fewer footprints. If she left for a reason of her own, then investigators had to consider where a 9-year-old believed she could go. Children sometimes act on ideas that adults would never guess, shaped by emotion, imagination, embarrassment, loyalty, or a plan that makes sense only for a little while. But such an explanation still leaves the larger question of what happened after she reached the highway, because leaving the house does not account for disappearance across decades. It may explain the first steps, if it is true, but it does not explain the last known trace. The road remains the crossing point. If she was taken after leaving, then the window was narrow and quiet. It would have involved a person who encountered her when few witnesses were outside, in weather that limited visibility, along a road where passing vehicles might notice something only for a moment. That possibility has long shaped public understanding of the case, especially once the book bag was found far away and later vehicle information became known. But even a plausible possibility is not a solved fact, and investigators still needed names, evidence, and a chain of events strong enough to withstand scrutiny. That chain has remained incomplete. The age of the case made every renewed search both hopeful and heavy. When officers executed later warrants and searched properties, the public naturally wondered whether the answer was finally approaching, while investigators had to remain careful about what they could say. Items of interest might be collected, vehicles might be examined, phones or records might be reviewed, and still no immediate public resolution might follow. In a patient investigation, a search can mean movement without finality, and a quiet period afterward does not necessarily mean the lead has vanished. It means the work has gone back inside the process. That process is slower than public attention. Laboratories take time, interviews take time, legal review takes time, and old evidence must be compared with new evidence carefully enough that no step is wasted. Detectives cannot rush because the public is watching, and they cannot speak freely just because people are anxious for news. The best cold case work often looks from a distance like stillness. Up close, it is a desk covered with reports, a phone call made carefully, a property record checked twice, and a question asked one more time with quiet precision. So when we ask why the Asha Degree case went cold, the honest answer is not a single failure, but a long convergence of difficulties. The night was dark and wet. The child's departure was unexplained. The sightings were brief. The physical trail was thin. The strongest object appeared too late and too far away. And later leads had to travel backward through many years of fading memory. That answer is not satisfying in the way people want answers to be satisfying, but it is more truthful than forcing the case into a shape it has not yet earned. And still, the coldness is not complete. A case can be cold and active at the same time, cold in the sense that the first heat of the trail has faded, active in the sense that people continue returning to it with new tools and old devotion. Asha's file remains open because the unanswered parts are too important to close, and because evidence, memory, and conscience can all move in ways no one can schedule. Somewhere, a detail may still be waiting inside a person's memory, inside a stored object, inside a lab result, or inside a record. No one has yet connected. The waiting is long, but it is not empty. You can imagine the old road again now, not as a place of fear, but as a place being patiently remembered. Cars pass in daylight, rain dries, trees grow, and people drive to work or school without thinking of every question that once gathered there before sunrise. But the case has taught many people to look more carefully at ordinary places, to understand that a shoulder of road, a shed, a book bag, or a forgotten shirt can hold meaning when time rearranges it. The road continues to exist, and the investigation continues to listen. In the quietest part of the story, there is no need to raise the voice. The facts are heavy enough when placed gently on the table, one beside another, and allowed to remain there without ornament. A child left home, witnesses saw her, searchers looked, evidence appeared, years passed, and still people kept asking. That is the patient heart of the case. Not the drama of a sudden revelation, but the slow endurance of a question that has not released the people who love her. The file stays open because love, duty, and evidence all ask it to remain. One of the quiet truths in any long investigation is that a file does not only contain what is known, because it also preserves the shape of what could not be learned. The blank spaces become visible after a while, not as empty pages, but as places where witness memory ended, where weather interfered, where evidence did not survive, or where an early lead led carefully to nothing. You learn to read absence almost as carefully as presence, because the missing answer has its own outline in the reports. In Asha's case, that outline has stayed steady for years. The first blank space is the private reason for leaving, if leaving was indeed the first act in the morning sequence. A child may carry an idea quietly for hours or days without giving it to the adults who love her, and once that child is gone, the idea can become impossible to recover with certainty. Investigators could ask her classmates, relatives, teachers, coaches, neighbors, and church connections whether anything seemed different, but even the most careful interviews could only gather what other people were able to see. A private thought leaves no fingerprints, and that is one reason the beginning stayed so clouded. The second blank space is the road itself, because roads witness everything and remember nothing unless someone else remembers for them. A car passes, a driver looks, a child moves from the shoulder toward a darker place, and the moment becomes meaningful only later, when the radio and television explain what no one understood in real time. The people who reported seeing Asha may have carried the sighting honestly, but a few seconds of observation from a moving vehicle can't become a full account of direction, expression, distance, and intent. The highway gave investigators a location, but not a complete story. The third blank space is the person or people who may have entered the case after those first steps. If someone encountered Asha, whether by planning, chance, deception, or some other circumstance never made public, then that person became the keeper of the most important information. Police can search outward from a road, inward through a family's routines, backward through a child's contacts, and forward through objects found later. But the individual who knows the missing link may remain outside every circle drawn on a map. That is the painful simplicity at the center of so many cold cases. The truth may exist, but it may exist inside silence. Silence is not always a dramatic thing. Sometimes it is a person who heard a strange comment and dismissed it, or a relative who noticed an old car disappear and never connected it to the news, or someone who was young then and only later understood the adults around them were hiding something. Sometimes silence is fear, loyalty, confusion, shame, or the ordinary human tendency to leave the past alone when it has become uncomfortable. Investigators know this, and so they return to the public not only asking for evidence, but asking for permission, in a way, for someone to let an old memory become useful. This is why anniversaries matter in Asha's case. They are not merely dates for remembering. They are moments when investigators and family members can ask the world to look again under the gentle pressure of time. A person who ignored a news story in one year may listen differently in another, because relationships change, old fears weaken, and the mind can open doors that were once kept firmly closed. The same appeal, spoken with the same care, may reach a different listener after 10 years, 15 years, or 20 years. In cold case work, repetition is not failure, it is persistence. The annual return to Valentine's Day carries this patient repetition into the calendar. Each year, the same date arrives with its familiar public softness, with cards in stores and flowers near grocery entrances, and with the Degree family remembering a morning that divided their lives. The contrast is quiet, but it is profound, because the world continues to wrap the day in affection, while one family carries the unfinished knowledge of absence. For investigators, the date also becomes a yearly chance to remind people that the case still belongs to the present, even though the child disappeared long ago. The past is asked to answer again. There is also the matter of childhood, which gives this case much of its enduring difficulty. Adults sometimes imagine children as simpler than they are, but children hold hopes, worries, embarrassments, loyalties, and plans in ways that can be hard for grown people to reconstruct afterward. Asha's family knew her deeply, of course, and their descriptions of her have always mattered. Yet even loving parents cannot see every thought that passes through a child's mind before sleep. Investigators had to respect both realities, that she was known and loved, and that some part of the night may have remained private to her. That small private place became unreachable. If you were reviewing the case with the detective's patients, you might spend a long time with the basketball game from that weekend. Not because it explains the disappearance by itself, and not because a child's disappointment should be enlarged beyond fairness, but because investigators must examine the last ordinary days before an extraordinary event. A lost game, a foul, a feeling of letting people down, a quiet evening afterward, and the normal comfort of family routines all sit in the timeline. The question is whether any of it formed a motive, or whether it was simply the last visible emotion before a much stranger morning. There is danger in overreading that detail, and good investigators know it. Many children have difficult games, disappointing weekends, or small embarrassments, and they do not leave their homes before dawn in rain. The detail belongs in the file because it happened and because it affected Asha, but it cannot be made responsible for everything that followed without stronger evidence. In a cold case, restraint protects the truth from being covered by a convenient story. You place the basketball game where it belongs, neither too large nor too small, and then you keep looking. The same restraint applies to the power outage. It is a memorable detail, and it shaped the household's evening, but it does not explain the full disappearance on its own. The darkness may have affected sleep, timing, or the way family members remembered the night, and it may have made the house feel different in those late hours, but it does not tell us why a book bag was packed or why a child reached the highway. Still, investigators had to include it because unusual conditions often matter around missing person timelines. A power outage can become a marker, a kind of the household timeline was built from ordinary observations, and ordinary observations can become fragile under the weight of later importance. A parent checks on sleeping children. A child's brother hears movement but may not fully wake. Lights come back on, someone goes to bed. Morning arrives, and only afterward does every minute become part of a formal reconstruction. No family expects to preserve a night like evidence while they are living it. That is why detectives ask the same questions carefully, not to doubt grief, but to help memory find the clearest path it can. The timeline depends on kindness as well as precision. Outside the house, the highway timeline depended on passing strangers. Those drivers did not stop into an investigation in the moment. They drove through darkness, rain, and rural quiet, noticing something unusual and then continuing because life often asks people to keep moving. Later, when Asha's disappearance became known, their memory returned with new force, and what had seemed merely odd became potentially central. This is a familiar pattern in investigations, where a witness does not know they are a witness until the world changes around the memory. By then, the road has already gone silent. The witness who reportedly turned around may have come closest to contact, though the account still leaves the crucial distance intact. Concern caused the driver to look again, but the girl moved away, perhaps frightened, perhaps determined, perhaps confused, and the moment did not become a rescue or a conversation. That is the sadness of near contact in a case file. The closeness can feel almost unbearable when read years later, even though no one inside the moment knew its future importance. The investigation has had to live with that nearness, because nearness without contact can haunt a file for a very long time. And yet, it is important not to judge the witnesses harshly from a later vantage point. People driving before dawn in rain do not expect to be crossing paths with a missing child, and the mind often treats strange sights as solvable by ordinary explanations. Perhaps a child is near home, perhaps a parent is nearby, perhaps the shape in the rain has been misunderstood, perhaps it is not as young as it first appeared. Only later does hindsight sharpen everything. Patient retelling requires compassion not only for the family, but for every person who later wondered whether they might have done more. The early searchers also carried their own burdens. Volunteers, officers, neighbors, and relatives moved through cold, wet ground, calling a child's name, watching ditches and fields, checking places where someone small might have taken shelter. Some of them may still remember the smell of wet grass, the weight of soaked clothing, the way a search can feel both urgent and strangely methodical at the same time. Searching is physical work, but it is also emotional labor because every step holds hope and dread together. They searched because they cared, and caring did not guarantee finding. When the first searches did not locate Asha, the case began shifting into a different kind of effort. A missing child case is at first a race through known spaces, but as the hours and days lengthened, it becomes an inquiry into unknown movement. Where could she have gone? Who could have seen her? What vehicles passed? What properties bordered the road? Which homes had lights on? Which dogs barked? Which workers started early? Which memories might still be waiting at kitchen tables? The questions spread outward in widening rings. Each ring took time. Time, in turn, created its own complications. A person who remembered seeing something might delay reporting it because it seemed unimportant, because they were unsure, or because they assumed someone else had already called. Another person might report something confidently that turned out unrelated, and investigators would still have to use precious hours to check it. A report could be honest but misplaced by date, or accurate in location but wrong in description, because human memory is helpful and flawed in the same breath. The file grew, but growth is not always the same as direction. That distinction matters when thinking about why the case went cold. An investigation can become large without becoming clearer, and sometimes the size of a file reflects not progress, but the enormous effort required to rule things out. Every eliminated lead matters, because it prevents detectives from chasing the same false path again. Yet eliminated leads rarely comfort a family waiting for the one lead that remains. They are the negative space of detective work. They show that people searched the edges. The discovery of the book bag changed the emotional temperature again. More than a year had passed, and then an object belonging to Asha appeared far from the first search area, wrapped in a way that suggested someone had wanted it hidden. For investigators, this was not simply a sad discovery. It was a new evidentiary event, demanding careful preservation, laboratory review, and renewed thought about geography and movement. For the family, it must have been another opening of the wound, because an object can feel close to the person who carried it, and impossibly far from answers. A book bag is one of the most personal objects in a child's everyday life. It carries school papers, books, small treasures, clothing, crumbs, pencils, notes, and all the ordinary disorder of a day that expects another day after it. When that kind of object appears in a roadside or construction setting, wrapped and removed from its proper world, it carries the ache of interruption without explaining the interruption itself. Investigators could inventory the contents and test what could be tested, but the deeper meaning still depended on finding the person who moved it. The bag had traveled beyond childhood. The wrapping of the bag has always seemed important to people who follow the case. Wrapping can suggest concealment, preservation, disposal, or some mixture of intentions that only the person responsible could explain. It may indicate planning or panic, or an attempt to keep the bag from being noticed, and each possibility leads toward a different understanding of the person who handled it. Investigators had to think about practical questions too, such as where the bags came from, whether they were common, whether any trace remained, and whether the wrapping protected evidence by accident. Even concealment can sometimes preserve what time might otherwise damage. That possibility is part of the strange patience of forensic work. The person who hid evidence may be trying to erase a trail, but the method of hiding can sometimes protect the very traces they hoped would disappear. A sealed bag may shield contents from weather, though it may also create its own conditions of moisture, degradation, or contamination, depending on how it was stored and where it lay. Investigators cannot know in advance which future technique might become useful, so they preserve, label, test carefully, and sometimes wait. Evidence has its own long sleep. While the book bag waited in evidence, public interest moved in waves. Anniversaries brought renewed coverage, then quieter months followed, and each wave invited another round of memories from people who might have seen, heard, owned, borrowed, driven, or noticed something relevant. The rhythm can feel repetitive from outside the family, but repetition is one of the few tools available when no suspect has been publicly charged. You keep the face visible, You keep the details accurate, you keep the tip line open, and you trust that one day the right memory may arrive. Hope becomes disciplined. That discipline was visible in the way Asha's family continued speaking. They did not let the public turn her into only a mystery, and they did not let time erase the child from behind the investigation. They reminded people of her personality, her shyness, her seriousness, her place in the family, and the fact that a missing child is not a symbol, but a person whose life belonged to many others. Their public steadiness has been one of the lasting facts of the case. It is not evidence in the technical sense, but it has helped keep the search alive. Investigators, too, had to balance hope and discipline. They could not share every possible clue, because some details need to remain known only to law enforcement and the person who may be responsible. They could not promise answers after each renewed search, because promising too much can harm a family already carrying more uncertainty than anyone should. They could not let public pressure force the case into premature conclusions, because a cold case must still be built with the same care as any other case. The work had to remain quietly exact. In the later re-examinations, the old reports would have been read not only for what they said, but for what they might have meant before anyone understood their importance. A name mentioned once in passing, a vehicle described without confidence, a timeline inconsistency, a property connection, or an object found in the wrong place can look different after years of additional context. Cold case detectives often describe this as seeing the case with fresh eyes, though those eyes must also be respectful of the original work. Freshness without humility can distort the past, while humility without curiosity may leave it unchanged. So the modern review of Asha's case had to be both careful and imaginative. Careful enough to avoid speculation becoming fact, and imaginative enough to ask whether old evidence could be interpreted through newer methods, newer databases, and newer patterns of understanding. Investigators could compare witness statements more systematically, examine relationships that may not have seemed significant, and consider whether someone close to the geography of the case had remained hidden in plain view. These are slow acts, not dramatic ones. They are the ordinary craft of reopening a file. The case also shows how a child's disappearance can become difficult when there is no clear crime scene in the traditional sense. The home did not provide the kind of evidence expected in a forced abduction from inside a house, and the roadside did not preserve a neat scene for investigators to seal and process. The shed area offered traces, and the book bag offered physical evidence. But the crucial transition from walking child to missing child happened somewhere not fully known. Without that central location, the investigation had to move through possibilities rather than a single defined place. A place can anchor an investigation. It can hold measurements, photographs, fibers, impressions, doorways, sightlines, entry points, and timelines that can be built from physical facts. In Asha's case, the absence of one clear anchor meant that investigators had to work across several locations, each meaningful but incomplete. The house showed departure. The highway showed movement. The shed suggested a pause or passage, and the book bag showed later concealment far away. The missing anchor may be where the answer lies, and that place has never been publicly found. This is why the phrase "went cold" should be understood gently. It does not mean the case froze into neglect. It means the known trail reached points where it could not move forward without new information. A cold case is often an active waiting room, where detectives keep the chairs ready, the lights on, and the old evidence protected, while hoping that science, memory, or conscience will eventually knock. The public may see only a closed door, but behind it, there can be years of deliberate care. In Asha's case, the door has remained unlocked. There is something deeply human about that unlocked door. It says that a community, a family, and a group of investigators have not accepted the absence of an answer as the end of the story. It also says that truth can sometimes require more time than anyone should have to give, and that justice, if it comes, may come because people refuse to stop doing quiet, uncelebrated tasks. An old phone number is checked, an interview is revisited, a lab technique is tried, and a forgotten object is examined again under better light. The work keeps breathing. As you rest with this case, you may notice that its unanswered parts do not need to be made louder. The softness of the telling is not a way of making it less serious, but a way of allowing seriousness to exist without sharp edges. Asha's story deserves care because it involves a child, a family, and a long public search that has asked people to remember responsibly rather than consume a mystery. The calmness is part of the respect. It leaves room for facts, for uncertainty, and for the quiet dignity of everyone who has kept her name present. The older the case becomes, the more the investigation depends on the careful meeting of past and present. Past evidence has to meet present science, past witnesses have to meet present questions, and past silence has to meet the possibility of present courage. Nothing about that meeting is guaranteed, but many long investigations have shown that years do not always close a file completely. Sometimes time weakens fear, sometimes it reveals patterns, sometimes it creates distance from old loyalties, and sometimes it allows a person to speak after carrying knowledge too long. Cold does not always mean ended. In Asha's case, the unanswered mourning remains fixed, while everything around it has aged. Her classmates became adults, her parents continued to wait, investigators retired and others arrived. Old vehicles became an age-progressed image that asked the world to imagine her grown. That is one of the quiet sorrows of missing person cases. The way time keeps moving for everyone, except the person at the center of the file, whose public image often remains tied to the day they vanished. The investigation tries, in its own way, to restore continuity. Continuity is what families want, even when they may not use that word. They want to know what happened after the last known moment, how 1 hour led to the next, who was present, what choices were made, and where their loved one went. They want the broken line to be drawn again, not because knowing removes grief, but because not knowing leaves grief without a clear shape. Detectives search for that line with evidence, while families search for it with memory and hope. Both searches can last a very long while. The Degree family's public statements over the years have often carried that mixture of hope and pain. They have asked for answers, asked people to come forward, and continued to believe that someone, somewhere, can help. Their appeals have not been theatrical. They have been steady, specific, and rooted in the simple fact that Asha was loved before the world knew her name. That steadiness has shaped how many people understand the case, because it has kept attention on the child and not on speculation. Love has been the case's quiet center. When an investigation has such a center, the duty of retelling is to move carefully around it. You do not take the family's pain and turn it into entertainment, and you do not take unanswered questions and pretend they are puzzles made for easy solving. You sit beside the file, read slowly, and let the facts remain sober, ordinary, and unfinished. The road, the rain, the book bag, the sightings, the shed, the green car, the school book, the shirt, the annual walks, and the renewed searches all remain there. Each detail is a small lamp. Together, those lamps do not yet light the whole room. They show corners, edges, surfaces, and paths that begin but do not reach a final door. This is why the case went cold. Not because the lamps were never lit, but because the space between them remained too wide for investigators to cross with certainty. They could not charge a shadow, could not build a case from sympathy, and could not transform possibility into proof without the missing pieces that law and truth both require. The darkness between facts has to be respected. Respecting that darkness does not mean surrendering to it. It means refusing to invent what has not been found while continuing to search for what may still be found. It means asking the public to remember responsibly, asking laboratories to look again when methods improve, asking investigators to read old pages with patience, and asking anyone who knows something to understand that even a small truth can matter after many years. A cold case does not always need a grand revelation. Sometimes it needs one quiet sentence from the right person. That sentence might be about a car. It might be about a bag. It might be about someone's behavior after the disappearance. A strange possession, a route taken, a story told too often or not often enough. It might be about the library book, the shirt, the place where the bag was hidden, or a memory from a household where children's belongings did not quite belong. Investigators have asked for such fragments because fragments can connect. A small piece placed correctly can make an old timeline shift. Until then, The patient work continues in the way patient work often does, with little public sound. There are no neat chapters inside the actual file, no music under the interviews, no final page waiting conveniently at the end of an episode. There is only the long discipline of evidence, the long tenderness of family memory, and the long civic responsibility of people who still recognize a missing child's face. The case remains unsolved, but not untouched. It has been touched by years of care. And perhaps that is the gentlest way to understand why it went cold without losing sight of why it remains alive. The trail cooled because the crucial facts were hidden, washed, delayed, fragmented, or held back. But the search stayed warm because people kept returning to Asha's name. In the strange balance of cold casework, both things can be true at once, and both truths deserve to be held without forcing them apart. The mystery is old now, but the obligation is not. It waits, still open, in the quiet light of another careful review. A careful review begins again where most lives begin, not with a mystery, but with a home and the ordinary traces of belonging. Asha's room was shared with her brother, and that detail matters because it reminds you that she was not alone in the abstract sense, not a figure drifting through a case without family around her. She was part of a household with schedules, familiar voices, sibling closeness, school routines, church routines, and the small repeated habits that make a child's life feel held. The question is not whether she was loved, because all accounts make that clear. The question is how a child surrounded by those patterns came to step outside them. Investigators had to examine the possibility of preparation, because the missing book bag and clothing suggested that the departure was not purely accidental or momentary. Yet preparation by a 9-year-old can be hard to interpret, because it may reflect a serious plan, a child's imagined errand, a misunderstanding or an emotional decision that seemed temporary until the outside world intervened. The same act can look different depending on what came before and who, if anyone, influenced it. This is where the case grows delicate. Delicacy is not weakness in an investigation. It is the awareness that a fact can injure if it is handled roughly, especially when that fact belongs to a child and a family whose lives have already been open to public judgment. Detectives asking about home life, school life, friendships, disappointments, and fears were not merely gathering details. They were entering private rooms of memory, and they had to do that with both persistence and care. The file needed honesty, but honesty did not require harshness. Patient work often has a gentle voice. In the early interviews, people described Asha as shy, responsible, cautious, and close to those around her. Such descriptions can help investigators understand what was unusual, though they cannot predict every decision a child might make in a private moment. A cautious child can still be persuaded, a responsible child can still make a sudden choice, and a shy child can still carry an idea quietly if she believes it matters. Character helps form the frame, but it does not finish the picture. The picture remained unfinished from the start. You might linger over the simple fact that Asha packed her bag, because packing is such an ordinary action, and such a strange one in this context. A child putting things into a book bag may feel organized, purposeful, perhaps even brave in her own mind, though the adults who later find the bag missing can only see the emptiness it left behind. Was she leaving for minutes, hours, or a destination she imagined clearly? And did she believe she would return before anyone understood she was gone? These questions are quiet, but they travel far. They travel into school where children borrow books, share stories, carry papers home, and notice one another's moods in ways adults may not always hear. Investigators would have asked whether Asha mentioned plans, worries, gifts, secrets, or someone she expected to meet, because children sometimes speak plainly to one another, while adults remain outside the conversation. But classmates were children too, and children's memories can be bright in one place and soft in another, especially after news spreads and adults begin asking careful questions. The school context mattered, yet it did not yield a public answer. They travel into church, another place where a child can be known by many and watched over by a community, while still carrying thoughts no one sees. Church life can create routine, trust, and familiarity, and investigators had to consider all spaces where Asha interacted with adults and children beyond her immediate household. That does not mean suspicion belongs to any one circle. It means a serious investigation must trace every circle a child moved through, because opportunity and knowledge often live inside ordinary familiarity. The difficulty is that ordinary familiarity can be enormous. It can stretch across a whole community. They travel into family gatherings because the weekend included relatives, shared time, and the warm disorder of people moving in and out of one another's lives. Family members could describe what she wore, how she seemed, whether she was quiet or upset, whether she said anything unusual, and whether the lost basketball game still seemed to be weighing on her. Each account added texture, but not enough direction. The days before the disappearance remained recognizable as family days, and that recognizability made the morning more difficult to understand. Normality can be a barrier. When a case begins in normality, investigators look for the seam where normal life was opened. Sometimes that seam is obvious, such as a conflict, a threat, a stranger, or a trace left at a scene. Sometimes it is hidden under the very routines that make a household feel safe, and the search for it becomes a long review of small deviations. Did a light remain on? Did a bag seem fuller? Did a child mention something and then withdraw? Did anyone call, visit, drive by, or wait outside? The file asks these questions in a whisper. The whisper continues through the account of O'Brien, who shared the room and later became part of the timeline through what he heard or noticed. A sibling's memory is a tender kind of evidence because it belongs to a child who was also living inside the event, not observing it as an adult investigator. He may have heard movement, perhaps the rustle of a bed or bag, but a half-awake child in a dark room cannot be expected to understand a future disappearance unfolding nearby. That small nearness is one of the case's quiet sorrows. He was close, and still the answer passed beyond reach. For the parents, the morning discovery became the first terrible moment of investigation. Before police reports, before television segments, before theories from strangers. There was a family looking through rooms, checking closets, checking cars, calling relatives, and trying to make sense of a missing child in a home that had seemed secure. It is worth pausing there, because the first search in many missing person cases is not conducted by professionals. It is conducted by the people who know the person best, moving through familiar spaces that suddenly feel foreign. Love begins the search before procedure arrives. Procedure, when it arrived, had to take over without extinguishing that love. Officers needed facts, times, descriptions, clothing, recent events, possible destinations, photographs, and the careful cooperation of a family in shock. They needed to move quickly while also documenting accurately, because early hours can produce both the best chances and the easiest mistakes. The Degree family's information became the foundation for the search, and the search moved from house to road to wider county spaces. Every outward step depended on the fragile first timeline. A timeline seems firm when printed, but it is often built from human recollection, estimated clocks, routine habits, and later, reconstruction. The power outage gave certain anchors, the checks on the children gave others, and the morning wake-up provided the sharpest point where absence became known. Between those anchors lay the dark interval in which Asha left. The whole investigation had to pass through that interval, and the interval did not widen easily into explanation. It remained narrow, silent, and important. The rain was falling during some of the relevant hours, and the road would have been unpleasant for any pedestrian, let alone a child. That fact is repeated so often because it presses against the idea of a casual departure, making the morning feel purposeful or driven by something adults have never been able to identify. Yet weather alone cannot tell whether the purpose belonged to Asha, to someone influencing her, or to circumstances that remain unknown. Rain changes the mood of a story, but investigators cannot treat mood as evidence. They needed the reason behind the rainwalk. In the absence of that reason, the highway sightings became more important than they might otherwise have been. The motorists' reports gave investigators confidence that Asha had made it away from the house and along the road, which shifted the case from an indoor disappearance to one involving movement through public space. That mattered because public space creates potential witnesses, vehicles, and chance encounters, but it also scatters possibilities across every driver who passed and every property near the route. The known world widened, and the widened world became harder to search. A rural or semi-rural road before dawn is not empty, but its traffic is thin and uneven. Workers, truck drivers, early commuters, and people moving before regular daylight may pass without ever knowing their route will later be studied by law enforcement. Some vehicles are local and familiar, while others are passing through, carrying drivers who may never see the local news or connect their memory to a missing child. Investigators had to think beyond the immediate neighborhood because Highway 18 was both local road and traveling path. Movement creates possibility. Possibility, again, is not proof. A possible driver, possible car, possible destination, possible sighting, and possible memory all require verification before they can become part of the stronger case. This is where a cold investigation can become almost meditative in its repetition, because detectives return again and again to the same careful verbs. Confirm, compare, eliminate, preserve, ask, revisit, and wait. Those words are plain, but they are the language of patience. The shed area associated with the upholstery business near the route offered investigators a place where the abstract became physical again. Items believed to belong to Asha suggested she may have been there, or that her belongings were there, and that gave searchers a point to examine with more focus. But even a place with items does not automatically become the place where the decisive event occurred. It may be a pause, a hiding place, a shelter from rain, a point of passing, or something else entirely. You can picture the investigators looking at that area after reports brought attention to it, watching their steps, photographing what needed to be photographed, and trying to separate environmental clutter from meaningful traces. A shed is not a sealed room, and outdoor or semi-outdoor spaces collect debris, footprints, dust, weather effects, animal movement, and the marks of ordinary work. The challenge is not only finding items, but understanding their placement, timing, and relationship to the missing person. Evidence outdoors must contend with the world around it. The world keeps moving. The items were small, and small things can become strangely powerful in a missing child case. A pencil or marker can bring to mind homework, school desks, and the casual way a child carries tools for ordinary days, while a hair bow can feel almost too personal to see in an evidence discussion. Investigators had to treat them as objects with possible evidentiary value, but everyone else could feel their human meaning immediately. The coldness of a case file and the warmth of a child's belongings exist side by side. Neither cancels the other. After the first searches and early discoveries, the investigation entered the phase where leads come from everywhere. Some came from people nearby, some from people farther away, some from those who believed they saw Asha, and some from those who thought a person in their own life deserved attention. A public case invites help, and it also invites confusion, because human beings are pattern-seeking by nature, especially when a child is missing and the need to help is strong. Detectives had to welcome information without being swept away by it. That is a hard balance. The balance becomes harder when the case is emotionally well known. People begin to remember where they were when they heard, what road they drove, what car they saw, what someone said, and sometimes those memories become braided with news reports, community conversation, and private worry. A sincere witness may unconsciously borrow details from later coverage, not to mislead, but because memory is porous. Investigators understand this, and so they ask about original impressions, first reports, timing, and what was known before public details were released. The aim is to find the uncontaminated center of memory. Uncontaminated memory is rare after time has passed. That does not make witnesses useless, but it means their accounts must be handled with care, corroborated where possible, and placed beside records that do not change so easily. Phone records, school records, property records, vehicle records, evidence logs, and early written reports can help steady recollection, though even records have their own gaps. The detective's work is to weave memory and documentation without letting either one dominate unfairly. This is slow work, and slow work can look like nothing until it matters. The book bag's discovery in 2001 gave investigators something records and memory could both gather around. It was no longer only a question of who saw whom on a rainy morning. It was a question of how Asha's belongings reached another place, wrapped and hidden beyond the original search area. The discovery did not answer the case, but it changed the conversation from disappearance alone to concealment of evidence. That change mattered, because concealment suggests an actor with knowledge after Asha left the road. Still, it did not name the actor. The location near Morganton raised questions about route and familiarity. Was the person connected to both areas, traveling the highway for work, family, errands, or habit? Or was the disposal site chosen simply because it was away from Shelby and unlikely to be checked? Did the location mean something to the person? Or was it only convenient, a place to remove an object from view? Investigators would have had to consider traffic patterns, local knowledge, and the practicalities of where someone could stop without drawing attention. The bag's location was a clue, but clues require context. Context can be difficult to reconstruct when a year and a half has passed. The ground where the bag was found had its own history before construction uncovered it, and investigators had to consider how long it had been there, whether it had been moved, and what environmental conditions affected it. If it had been hidden soon after Asha vanished, then it had waited through seasons, rain, heat, cold, and the quiet alterations of roadside land. If it was placed later, that raised a different set of questions. Either way, time had already become part of the evidence. The contents were examined, but only some details were made public, and that restraint was likely intentional. Investigators often hold back specific information so they can evaluate future tips, test confessions or claims, and protect avenues that might still lead somewhere. The public may want every detail, because every detail feels like a possible key, but giving away too much can make false information harder to identify. In cold cases, secrecy can be an act of preservation. Silence, when used carefully by investigators, can protect the future of the case. The library book and the shirt were shared because investigators wanted recognition from the public. That decision suggests those items stood apart in some meaningful way, perhaps because Asha's family did not identify them as hers, or because their origin remained uncertain after internal checks. The public appeal turned ordinary objects into memory prompts, inviting people to search their own past for a book on a shelf, a shirt in a drawer, or a child's conversation from long ago. This is not a loud kind of investigation. It is more like knocking softly on many doors. Some doors open years later because a person finally understands what they know. A former classmate might remember an object in circulation. A relative might remember a shirt in a family home. A neighbor might remember an old car. Or an adult might recall a remark that once seemed strange but not relevant. The challenge is that relevance often arrives after the chance to document everything perfectly has gone. Still, investigators ask because imperfect memory can become useful when it connects with physical evidence or another independent account. A fragment can become stronger when it is not alone. Forensic re-examination can strengthen fragments too. An old object might be tested again for trace material, a hair, a fiber, a fingerprint, or a biological sample that earlier methods could not use well. But each test has to be chosen carefully because evidence can be limited and testing may consume material that cannot be replaced. Investigators and lab scientists must weigh the promise of new techniques against the need to preserve options for future methods that may be better still. Even science requires restraint. That restraint is one of the less visible forms of patience. It is tempting to imagine that every item can simply be tested for everything, but real laboratories operate under practical, legal, and scientific limits. Evidence may be degraded, mixed, touched by many people, or affected by years in storage or by the conditions before it was collected. A result may be partial, ambiguous, or not immediately connected to a known person. The public hears the word DNA and imagines certainty, but investigators know that certainty is earned only under the right conditions. The right conditions were not guaranteed in Asha's case. The early environment was wet, the later evidence was found after long concealment, and the case began before some modern expectations about evidence preservation had become standard across all investigations. That does not mean the evidence was mishandled. It means the case belongs to its time, and its time had tools and limitations different from those available now. Cold case work is partly the art of bringing old evidence into new capability without forgetting the circumstances of its origin. The past cannot be rewritten, nor can the early public response be rewritten, though it can be understood more clearly now. Asha's case did receive local and regional attention and later national attention in certain forms, yet many have noted that missing black children have often struggled for equal sustained coverage. That wider pattern matters because publicity can influence tips, memory, pressure, and resources, especially in the first days when information is still fresh. It is not the only factor in the case going cold, but it belongs among the pressures around it. Visibility can be a form of evidence gathering. When a child's face is shown widely and quickly, someone far from the immediate area may connect it to a sighting, a vehicle, a conversation, or an object. When coverage fades or remains limited, those connections may never form, or may form too late to be useful. Asha's family worked against that fading through public appearances, annual events, and steady appeals, and in doing so, they performed a kind of public investigative labor that families are rarely prepared for. They became keepers of attention. That work has been tiring but vital. The phrase, Shelby's sweetheart, grew from that effort and from the community's affection, though even affectionate phrases carry the risk of softening the harder truth. Asha was not only a beloved symbol, she was a particular child with particular habits, relationships, and a life that was interrupted in a way still unexplained. The best remembrance holds both the tenderness and the specificity. It says her name, remembers her face, and also asks exact questions about times, roads, objects, and people. Care becomes useful when it remains specific. Specificity is what investigators return to in later public appeals. They did not simply ask for anyone to say anything, they asked about a particular vehicle, particular items, particular locations, and particular time frames. A dark green early 1970s car with rust around the wheel wells is not a vague shadow. It is a shape someone may have seen in a driveway, a field, a garage, or beside a rural road. McElligot's pool and the New Kids on the Block shirt were not abstract symbols, they were objects with histories that may be traceable. Specifics give memory a handle, yet specifics can also narrow the public imagination too much if people assume they must know everything before calling. Investigators often remind communities that even small or uncertain information can matter, because a person may hold only one part of a pattern they cannot see. Someone may remember the car but not the driver, the shirt but not the owner, the route but not the date, or a remark but not its meaning. The work of the detective is to join fragments across many sources. The public does not need to solve the case before offering a piece. In this way, the investigation has always depended on cooperation between professional patients and community memory. Police can preserve evidence, organize leads, and conduct interviews, but they cannot enter every old household memory without someone opening it. Families can keep attention alive, but they cannot subpoena truth from silence. Communities can remember, but they need accurate facts to guide their remembering. A cold case stays alive when those forms of effort remain connected, even after the first urgency has faded. Connection is a quiet force. The case also depends on language, because how people describe Asha's disappearance affects how others understand it. Calling her a runaway too simply can shrink the seriousness of what followed, while assuming a stranger took her without proof can close off other possibilities too soon. The most careful language says that she appears to have left home and was later seen walking, and that what happened afterward remains unknown. That phrasing may feel less satisfying, but it is more faithful to the evidence. Accuracy is a form of respect. Respect also means protecting the dignity of people who were investigated and cleared, or whose names appeared only in rumor. Cold cases can attract speculation that clings to innocent people, especially when the public begins filling gaps with suspicion. Detectives know the difference between checking a lead and naming a person, and that difference matters deeply. A careful retelling should not drag private citizens into the story without evidence. The unknown is not permission to harm the known. The known facts are enough to explain much of the coldness. A child left under unexplained circumstances, passed briefly through public view, left few recoverable traces, and had belongings found later in a place that widened the geography. Possible clues surfaced years after the earliest memories were fresh, while the strongest public leads required people to remember objects, vehicles, or conversations from long ago. The investigation had to proceed through uncertainty at nearly every stage, and uncertainty slows everything it touches. It does not stop the work, but it makes each step heavier. Heaviness can settle over investigators as well as families. A detective may spend years with a case, leave it for another assignment, retire, return, or pass it to someone new, but the file remains with its photographs and unanswered notes. People who work on missing child cases often carry them privately, remembering details at odd moments, seeing a similar road or a similar backpack, and thinking again of the person they could not find. Professional distance helps, but it does not make investigators machines. Patient detective work is human work, and human work leaves marks. Those marks may be one reason retired investigators sometimes return to cold cases. They know the file's old language, the early choices, the community context, and the names that appear again and again in reports. New investigators bring fresh structure, but older investigators bring continuity, and in a case like Asha's, both forms of knowledge can matter. The long file needs people who remember how it began, and people who can see how it might move now. Between them, the case gains another chance to breathe. Breathing room is important because old cases can become crowded with certainty from outsiders. On the internet, theories can multiply quickly, and sometimes the loudest theory is not the one closest to the evidence, but the one easiest to tell. Asha's case has drawn many theories over the years, some thoughtful, some speculative, and some unfairly confident about things not publicly known. Investigators cannot solve a case by popularity of explanation. They have to solve it by evidence that can stand after emotion has quieted. That standard is strict. The strict standard may be frustrating, but it protects the possibility of justice. If an arrest is ever made, the case must be strong enough to answer defense questions, withstand scrutiny, and show not only what investigators believe, but why that belief is supported by reliable proof. Cold cases that rest on old evidence and old memories need special care, because the passage of time will be questioned at every turn. Detectives know that doing a thing quickly can sometimes mean doing it twice, or doing it wrongly. In Asha's case, patience is not delay for its own sake. Patience is the recognition that every step must be built well enough to carry the next. A witness re-interview may lead to a search may lead to an object may lead to testing may lead to a person, and a person may lead back to another interview. Or the chain may break, and investigators must begin again from another point in the file. This is why the work can take years without visible change. The public sees the surface, while the investigators test the links beneath it. Sometimes those links are geographic. A person connected to Shelby may also have had reason to travel toward Morganton, or a vehicle known in one area may have appeared in another. A work route, family tie, hunting property, repair shop, storage location, or old address can become meaningful only after another detail gives it weight. Geography in cold cases is not just distance, it is habit, opportunity, familiarity, and the places a person chooses when they think no one is watching. The map has a memory of movement if someone can read it. Sometimes the links are social. A person may have known the family directly, known Asha indirectly, known a classmate, known a relative, or belonged to a circle where trust made access easier. Investigators cannot assume danger always comes from a stranger, and they cannot assume familiarity always explains it either. The social map must be drawn carefully, with lines of contact, opportunity, and timing considered without turning entire communities into suspects. This is slow, sensitive work. It requires fairness. The shirt, the book, the bags around the book bag, the contents inside it, and any trace evidence not publicly described may connect to places, households, purchases, or people. Material evidence can outlast memory, but it still needs context before it becomes a story. A shirt may have been bought, borrowed, handed down, donated, stolen, misplaced, or placed deliberately, and each path leaves different kinds of traces. The object does not explain itself. It waits for context. The waiting is the theme that keeps returning, because this case has required waiting from everyone. The family waited through searches, through anniversaries, through renewed appeals, through the release of age-progressed images, through announcements of new leads, and through the quiet that followed them. Investigators waited for lab results, return calls, record checks, public responses, and the rare tip that survived careful review. The community waited for the day when the billboard might no longer ask a question. Waiting has become the case's weather. Unlike the rain of that first morning, this later weather does not wash away evidence. It settles over people. It changes how they speak, how they remember, how they hope, and how they protect themselves from hoping too sharply. Long unresolved cases teach a kind of cautious hope, one that can welcome new activity without believing too quickly that the end has arrived. The Degree family has lived with that caution for many years, and any careful retelling should honor it. Hope can be gentle and still strong. The public search for Asha has continued through posters and official pages, but also through conversations in homes, schools, churches, and local gatherings where people still ask what happened. Such conversations may seem informal, yet they help keep memory from closing completely. A person may hear the story again and remember an old detail, or a younger family member may ask an older one about a car, a route, or a strange object from years ago. The official investigation and the community's quiet remembering can meet in unexpected ways. Sometimes the smallest conversation creates a turn. That is why investigators have often asked people not to assume someone else has already called. In old cases, many people hold back because they think their information is too small, too vague, or too late. But a small detail can verify another detail, and a vague memory can direct investigators toward records that are less vague. Late information is not ideal, but it can still be valuable when it points to something that can be tested or corroborated. A cold case asks people to trust that even delayed truth may have use. Truth, in this case, has had to survive rumor. It has had to survive the natural human impulse to solve what remains open, the uneven attention given to missing children, and the long discomfort of public uncertainty. It has had to survive the fading of cars, roads, records, memories, and early assumptions. That it has survived at all is because people kept returning to the stable facts, even when those facts were not enough. The truth is not fully known, but the search for it has been preserved. Preservation is an act of faith as much as procedure. Evidence kept properly is evidence saying that tomorrow may be wiser than today, and that a file unresolved now may not remain unresolved forever. The book bag, its contents, the reports, the interviews, the maps, and the official appeals all belong to that future-facing hope. Each preserved item resists the erasure that time naturally brings. In an old case, preservation is a way of saying, not yet, not forgotten, not closed. When you imagine the evidence room, it may help not to picture it as a dark and neglected place. Picture instead shelves that hold many stories, each labeled because someone may one day need to return, and each dependent on careful custody rather than dramatic revelation. A sealed package can be a promise that the present has kept something safe for the future. A report can be a bridge between the person who first wrote it and the investigator who reads it decades later. The file itself becomes a kind of vigil. Asha's cases required that vigil because the first answer never arrived. Had the early search found her, the investigation would have had a different shape, even if the outcome remained painful. Had the book bag been found within days, memories of cars, people, and roadside activity near Morganton might have been fresher. Had the vehicle lead been identified immediately, records and owners might have been easier to trace. Each delayed discovery changed what could be done. Delay is one of the quiet engines of coldness, but delay does not explain everything. Some cases grow cold even when early work is strong, because the person responsible leaves little trace, or because the event itself occurs in a gap between witnesses. Asha's disappearance appears to have moved through such a gap, from home to road to unknown encounter, with only brief glimpses along the way. Investigators could reconstruct the edges, but not the middle. The middle remained hidden, and hidden middles are difficult to solve without someone or something opening them. The later search warrants and investigative activity suggested that authorities have continued testing possible openings. Each action may involve more information than the public can see, and each may be part of a larger effort to compare evidence, statements, and old leads. The public naturally wants each action explained, but investigators may remain silent because explanation could reveal strategy or compromise what they are trying to learn. This can feel frustrating, yet it is often necessary. A quiet investigation may be an active one. In sleep, as in patient investigation, there is value in letting questions rest without forcing them. The mind can hold the road, the rain, the house, the school book, the shirt, and the long years, and still not demand that the unknown become known before it is ready. That does not mean indifference. It means care without agitation, attention without noise, and respect for a case that has already carried enough heaviness. Asha's story can be remembered softly, and soft remembrance can still be serious. Serious remembrance returns to the child herself. Before any lead, before any theory, before any forensic technique, there was Asha, who belonged to a family, a school, a church, a team, and a community. She had a life made of ordinary days, which is exactly why the interruption of that life matters so deeply. The investigation exists not for the mystery, but for her, and for those who have waited through years of unanswered mornings. Keeping that order clear prevents the case from becoming merely a puzzle. It remains a promise. The promise is that the file will not be closed simply because time has made the work harder. The promise is that old evidence will be cared for. Old witnesses may be approached again, new tools will be considered, and the public will be reminded that the smallest honest detail can still matter. It is not a promise that answers will arrive on command, because no investigator can honestly make that promise. It is a promise of continued attention. Sometimes that is what patient work can give, and so the question of why the case went cold rests beside the question of why it has not gone away. It went cold because the path from Asha's bedroom to the highway, from the highway to the unknown, and from the unknown to the hidden book bag could not be fully traced with available evidence. It has not gone away because the people who love her, and the people responsible for the file, have continued to believe that the path may still be recoverable. Coldness and endurance have existed together for more than 2 decades. In that long coexistence, every renewed appeal becomes an act of careful defiance against forgetting. Every photograph released, every anniversary walk, every interview, every laboratory review, and every quiet file meeting says that time has passed, but it has not been allowed to have the final word. The case remains unsolved, but unsolved is not the same as abandoned. It means the answer has not yet been reached. It means the work continues under a lamp that has been kept lit. The lamp in this kind of case is made from ordinary care rather than certainty. It is the care of someone labeling evidence before placing it into storage, the care of a detective writing a date correctly, the care of a parent saying the same facts again because the facts still matter. It is also the care of a community that learns to speak a missing child's name without turning away from the discomfort of not knowing. In Asha's case, that care has remained visible even when the answer has not. The first years after a disappearance can be especially difficult because hope still has the feeling of nearness. People imagine that a call might come any day, that a witness might step forward, that a search might locate something overlooked, or that the next interview might finally make sense of the timeline. As months become years, hope has to change its shape in order to survive. It becomes less like waiting beside a ringing phone and more like tending a small fire through weather, feeding it carefully so it does not flare too wildly or go out. For investigators, the first years are also the time when a case begins to teach them what it will require. Some cases ask for technical work, some for geographic patience, some for repeated interviews, and some for the slow unraveling of relationships that were never fully visible at the beginning. Asha's case asked for all of these, and also for a kind of tolerance for uncertainty that can be hard to maintain. The obvious routes had to be searched, the unlikely routes checked, the false routes closed, and the unknown routes kept open. The file did not allow comfort. Comfort would have been a simple explanation. A child ran away for a clear reason and was found, or a stranger was identified quickly, or a known person's story broke down under questioning, or a physical trace made the next step unmistakable. Instead, the investigation offered fragments that pointed in different directions without completing any single path. The road showed movement, the shed suggested presence, The bag showed concealment, and the unfamiliar objects suggested contact or transfer, but the connecting line was still missing. This is how a case can remain active and cold at the same time. There is a certain humility required in saying that the line is missing. It means refusing to pretend that the known details add up to more than they do, even when the mind wants them to become a complete story. It means accepting that a person can study the case for years and still be left with questions that only evidence can answer. It also means honoring the investigators who have been careful enough not to overstate what they know. In patient detective work, humility is not a lack of effort, it is part of the method. The method includes returning to the beginning again and again, because beginnings are where assumptions first enter. Did the early understanding of Asha's departure shape the way people searched? And did the apparent voluntary movement along the highway make some possibilities seem stronger or weaker than they should have seemed? Did the focus on where she walked create blind spots around who may have known she would walk, or who may have been waiting somewhere farther along the route? These questions are not accusations. They are the careful rereading that cold cases require. Rereading a case is different from second-guessing it. Second-guessing often comes from the luxury of hindsight, while rereading comes from the responsibility to use hindsight wisely. The investigators who first responded did not have the later book bag discovery, the later vehicle information, the later forensic possibilities, or the years of accumulated tips that would eventually shape renewed inquiries. They had a missing child, rain, darkness, worried parents, and a narrow window in which speed mattered. The later investigator must remember that, even while asking what can now be seen more clearly, this is the patient fairness that the case deserves. It does not erase mistakes if mistakes were made, and it does not romanticize the early work as perfect, simply because people cared. It says only that the early hours were human, urgent, imperfect, and full of limited information, like nearly every difficult investigation in its first stage. From there, the case grew into something older and more complex, and later teams inherited both the evidence and the uncertainty. They inherited the weather of the first morning. That weather stayed in the story because it shaped the available trail. Rain on a dark highway can make a child more vulnerable, but it can also make sightings less precise and physical traces harder to preserve. The same condition that made the scene unusual also made it more difficult to read afterward. Investigators had to work with what remained, not with the dry, well-lit version of the morning anyone might wish for. In old case files, the weather is not background, it is a quiet participant. The road was a participant too. It carried people to work, moved traffic between communities, and offered no wall or doorway to seal when the investigation began. A house can be searched room by room, but a road extends beyond every first boundary, branching into other roads, other towns, other habits, and other unknown drivers. Once Asha reached that public space, if the sightings are understood correctly, the case became harder to contain. The world had widened around her, and the widened world left fewer edges. Edges matter in detective work because they tell investigators where to begin and end a search. In Asha's case, the edges were soft. The home had an edge, the highway had a general corridor, the shed had a possible point, and the book bag had a later location, but the transition between these points remained uncertain. A soft-edged case requires broader searching, more interviews, and a greater willingness to hold multiple possibilities for longer than anyone would prefer. Holding possibilities is tiring. It asks the mind not to settle. The public mind often wants to settle quickly, especially when the missing person is a child. A theory offers relief because it gives the unknown a name, even if the theory is fragile. But investigators cannot accept relief as evidence, and families cannot live safely on theories that may later collapse. The case needed something stronger than a story that felt right. It needed corroboration, physical evidence, reliable testimony, or a connection that could survive being examined from every side. Without that, the file stayed open. One reason the file stayed open is that Asha's belongings suggested layers rather than closure. The items near the shed did not end the search, and the book bag did not end the search, and the later public release of the book and shirt did not end the search. Each item created new questions about movement, contact, and custody. Who had the bag after Asha? Who placed items inside it? who wrapped it, who carried it north, and who decided where it would be left. The objects were silent, but their silence was full. When investigators encounter silent objects, they begin asking the questions objects can answer. Where was it made? Where was it sold? How common was it? Who handled it? How was it damaged? What was attached to it? What does its condition suggest about storage, exposure, and time? With a child's belongings, those questions sit beside softer ones that can't be asked in a laboratory, such as why this item was chosen, whether it mattered to her, and how it became separated from the ordinary life it belonged to. Science and tenderness share the same table. The book bag's contents also had to be understood through the family's knowledge. When a family says an item does not belong to their child, investigators listen carefully, because families often know clothing, books, and possessions with the intimacy of daily life. Yet they must also consider the ways objects can enter a child's bag without becoming familiar to parents, through school, friends, hand-me-downs, exchanges, mistakes, or brief contact. A family's memory is deeply important, but the investigative question still asks how an unfamiliar object arrived. That question remains patiently open. The public release of the unfamiliar objects many years later may have reflected the need to widen that question. Perhaps earlier efforts had not identified the origin, or perhaps investigators believed renewed attention could reach someone who had not seen the older appeals. A child who was in school then might be an adult now, able to understand the significance of a library book or a shirt in a way they could not as a child. Time dims memory, but it also matures witnesses. Someone who once knew too little may later know how to speak. Speaking can be hard after years have passed. A person may worry that they are misremembering, that their information is too late, that they will be blamed for not coming forward sooner, or that calling will disturb old relationships. Investigators often try to lower that barrier by asking for anything, however small, and by reminding people that the duty is not to be perfect, but to be honest. A small, honest memory can be checked against the file. Even uncertainty can have value. The vehicle appeal carried this same invitation. An old green car with rust around the wheel wells might be remembered by people who never knew the driver well, because distinctive cars often become neighborhood landmarks. Someone may remember seeing it parked near a house, hearing it mentioned in a family story, watching it sold, or noticing it vanish from a yard after attention around the case grew. The passage of time makes those memories harder, but the distinctiveness gives them a chance. In cold case work, chance is not certainty, but it is not nothing. The shape of that car, long and heavy from an earlier automotive era, belongs now more to memory than to the road. By the time investigators publicized it, such cars were less common, and many people who had once seen them daily would have to search backward through decades of ordinary life. Old vehicles can become repositories of family history, connected to uncles, neighbors, mechanics, fields, barns, and teenage rides remembered more by feel than by license plate. Asking about one is like asking people to open a drawer they have not touched in years. Inside may be dust or something useful. Even if someone remembers the car, investigators still need to connect it responsibly. A dark green Lincoln or Thunderbird from that period is not automatically involved because it existed near Cleveland County, and rust around wheel wells was not rare on older vehicles. The lead is important because of its possible connection to a sighting, not because every similar car is suspicious. That distinction protects innocent people and keeps the investigation grounded. Specific clues must be followed with fairness, or they can lead into harm. Fairness is another reason cold cases take time. Every person interviewed has a life, and every suspicion has consequences, even when it never becomes public. Investigators must ask difficult questions without deciding too quickly that unease equals guilt. They must follow evidence into uncomfortable places, but also be willing to leave those places when the evidence does not support staying. The discipline is moral as well as procedural. It asks the investigator to serve truth, not pressure. Pressure comes from many directions in a case like this. Families deserve answers. Communities want safety. Agencies want progress. And the public may grow impatient after every anniversary or renewed search. The media may ask for updates when investigators have little they can responsibly share. and online discussion may generate theories faster than evidence can be examined. Inside that pressure, the file still moves at the pace evidence allows. That pace can feel unbearably slow, but it is the only pace that can lead to a durable answer. Durability matters because the end of a cold case, if it comes, must not simply satisfy curiosity. It must be able to support justice, accountability, and a clear public understanding of what happened as far as the evidence can show. A weak answer would not honor Asha, and a rushed conclusion would not honor the family's long patience. Investigators know that after years of waiting, the standard does not lower. In some ways, it rises. The case has to be handled with even more care because it has waited so long. The waiting has included technological hope, especially around DNA and trace evidence. Many old cases across the country have been reopened through improved testing, and that history encourages families to believe that evidence stored long ago may still contain a path forward. But every case has its own evidence, and not every item yields a clean profile or a searchable result. The promise of technology is real, but it is not a guarantee. It must meet the actual objects in the actual file under actual conditions. Those conditions include the way items were collected, transported, stored, and tested over time. Chain of custody is not an exciting phrase, but it is one of the quiet foundations that lets old evidence matter in court. If investigators can show where an item was, who handled it, how it was packaged, and how it moved between agencies or laboratories, then later testing has a stronger legal footing. Cold case work depends on people long ago doing paperwork carefully. The future relies on old precision. Precision also helps when reviewing tips. A tip recorded with date, time, caller information, content, follow-up actions, and outcome can be revisited years later in a meaningful way. A vague note may still help, but it requires more reconstruction and can lose strength over time. This is why the invisible administrative side of investigation matters so deeply. The case file is not just a story, it is an instrument, and its usefulness depends on how carefully it was kept. In Asha's case, the file grew through several agencies and many years, which meant that coordination became part of the challenge. Local knowledge, state resources, federal assistance, forensic laboratories, public tip lines, and national missing child organizations all had roles that needed to connect without confusing the record. Coordination can bring strength because each agency offers different tools, but it also requires clear communication so that information does not fracture across systems. A cold case must be gathered into order again and again. Order is a form of hope. Hope appeared in the renewed federal attention and in the continued public appeals from law enforcement. The release of new information years later signaled that investigators still believed the case could move, and that someone outside the official circle might hold a missing piece. These appeals were not random acts of publicity. They were strategic invitations, shaped around details authorities believed the public could help identify. Even when they did not immediately solve the case, they kept certain facts alive in community memory. They kept the questions accurate. Accurate questions matter more than dramatic ones. Who remembers that book? Who remembers that shirt? Who remembers that green car? Who heard something after the 14th of February? Who noticed someone behaving differently? Who found something odd along the route or near Morganton? Each question has edges and can be tested more readily than broad speculation. The calmest investigations often ask the plainest questions. Plainness can be powerful. The question of behavior after the disappearance is especially important in many cold cases, though it must be handled without naming or accusing, without evidence. People who know more than they admit may change routines, discard objects, repaint or sell vehicles, avoid conversations, tell inconsistent stories, or show unusual interest in the investigation. Such behavior does not prove guilt by itself, but it can become meaningful when paired with evidence, timing, and opportunity. Investigators look for patterns that hold together. A pattern is stronger than a feeling. Feelings still have a place, but not as proof. A relative's unease, a neighbor's old suspicion, or a witness's sense that something was wrong can guide investigators toward questions, but the questions must then lead to facts. This distinction helps protect both the integrity of the case and the dignity of people touched by it. In a case with so much public attention, The difference between a lead and a conclusion must remain clear. Patient work separates wondering from knowing. Knowing, in Asha's case, remains limited but meaningful. We know she was reported missing on the morning of the 14th of February 2000, after leaving the family home sometime before dawn. We know witnesses reported seeing a young girl along Highway 18 in the early hours, and authorities have treated those sightings as significant. We know belongings connected to her were found near the route, and that her book bag was later found wrapped and hidden near Morganton. We know investigators have continued appealing for information about certain objects and a possible vehicle. The known facts form a frame. Inside that frame, many things remain uncertain. The reason for leaving, the identity of anyone who may have influenced her, the exact point where she left the highway or encountered someone, the timeline of the book bag's concealment, and the source of unfamiliar items remain publicly unresolved. Those uncertainties are not minor gaps. They are the central spaces that keep the case open. To say the case went cold is to say that those central spaces resisted all early efforts to fill them. It is not to say they will always resist. Sometimes an old case changes because a person dies and someone else feels free to speak. Sometimes it changes because a family home is cleaned out and an object is found, or because a vehicle record is digitized, or because a genetic match appears, or because a former child witness becomes an adult with clearer language. Investigators cannot plan for every such turning point, but they can keep the file ready to receive it. Readiness is one of the quiet virtues of cold case work. It says, when the detail arrives, we will know where to place it. Placement matters because a new detail by itself can be confusing. A person may call with a memory of a shirt, and investigators must determine whether that memory belongs before or after public images were released. A vehicle lead must be checked against ownership, location, condition, and timing. A name must be evaluated against opportunity and evidence, not rumor alone. Each new piece has to be fitted against the whole old structure. The case is a mosaic, and the wrong piece cannot be forced. The mosaic metaphor is gentle, but the work behind it is difficult. Some pieces are missing, some are damaged, some may belong to a different picture entirely, and some look promising until turned slightly under better light. Investigators learn not to fall in love too quickly with any single piece. They hold it, inspect it, compare it, and if it does not fit, they set it aside without bitterness. The goal is not to make a beautiful picture. The goal is to make a true one. Truth has a slower rhythm than speculation. It requires documents, interviews, evidence, testing, corroboration, and the willingness to say not yet. The phrase not yet can feel painful after so many years, but it is more honest than false closure. For Asha's family, not yet has been a heavy companion, but it has also kept the door from being closed. It leaves room for tomorrow's evidence, tomorrow's witness, tomorrow's method, or tomorrow's courage. In that small room, hope still rests. The idea of rest may feel surprising in a story like this, but rest is not forgetting. Rest is the way a long vigil survives, because no family, detective, or community can remain at the first day's pitch of alarm forever. The work must become sustainable, folded into annual appeals, ongoing case management, and renewed bursts of activity when something changes. That rhythm does not lessen the importance of the case. It allows the importance to endure. Endurance appears in the way Asha's name has remained publicly known in Cleveland County. Children who were not born when she vanished have grown up seeing her face and hearing the story from parents, teachers, or local media. For them, the case may feel like part of the landscape, like a road sign or a remembered warning, though it is important to keep reminding them that it began with a real child and real parents. Local memory can become routine if it is not refreshed with humanity. The annual walks and appeals help restore that human center. The center is Asha at 9 years old, but also Asha as she might have grown, which is why age-progressed images can be so moving. They ask viewers to hold two truths at once: the child who disappeared and the adult she should have had the chance to become. These images are investigative tools, but they are also quiet acknowledgments of time, showing that the missing person did not stop mattering when the calendar moved on. They allow the public to imagine recognition in the present. They keep the search from being trapped entirely in 2000. Still, the case's strongest known facts remain anchored in that year. The power outage, the basketball weekend, the family checks, the morning discovery, the highway sightings, the search, and the early found items all belong to the original frame. Revisiting them is not repetitive for its own sake. It is how investigators test whether new information changes the meaning of old information. A fact can remain the same while its context shifts around it. The old file can become new without altering a word. For example, a later vehicle lead might change how investigators view the roadside sightings. A later object lead might change how they view the book bag. A later interview might change how they interpret a child's possible preparation. None of these changes requires rewriting the past. They require understanding that the past was never fully known. Cold case work is, in part, the art of letting old facts receive new light. The facts do not move, but their shadows do. Shadows are useful only if you keep a light source steady. In this case, the steady light has been the official record, the family's consistent memory, and the community's continued willingness to listen. Without those, the case might have become a jumble of rumor and half-remembered details. With them, it remains an unsolved investigation with identifiable questions and preserved evidence. That difference matters. It is the difference between mystery as entertainment and mystery as responsibility. Responsibility asks the public to avoid turning uncertainty into accusation. It asks listeners, readers, and neighbors to remember that real people live near every theory, and that a name spoken carelessly can cause damage long before any truth is known. It also asks people with information not to hide behind the fact that time has passed. Responsibility moves in both directions, restraining speculation while encouraging honest disclosure. It is a quiet but necessary discipline. The discipline of disclosure may one day be what shifts the case. Someone may decide that an old loyalty no longer deserves protection, or that a family secret has become too heavy, or that a detail once dismissed now needs to be given to investigators. That person may not hold the whole answer. They may hold only a small part, but small parts are how many long cases finally change. The file has been waiting for something that fits. It can still receive it. Until then, the question, why did the case go cold, has to remain layered. It went cold because the evidence did not reveal the missing link, because early weather and darkness narrowed what could be seen, because the road widened the suspect field, because the book bag was found after too much time had passed, and because later clues had to rely on old memory. It went cold because the beginning was strange and the middle was hidden. But it remained alive because the ending has never been accepted as finished. There is quiet strength in that refusal. The Degree family's long public presence, the agency's continued work, and the community's remembrance together form a resistance to the natural erasing power of time. Time erases details, yes, but people can write them down, repeat them carefully, preserve them in evidence rooms, and ask again when asking still matters. The case is colder than it was in those first hours, but it is not beyond warmth. Warmth survives in attention. Attention may seem modest, especially when compared with the decisive answer everyone wants. But attention is what keeps a witness from assuming the case is closed, what keeps an investigator from overlooking a file, and what keeps the public from letting a missing child become only an old photograph. Attention creates the conditions in which evidence can matter when it appears. It is not the solution, but it may be the ground on which a solution one day stands. As the years continue, the case will likely be revisited whenever technology improves, whenever new information arrives, and whenever anniversaries bring renewed public appeal. This is not a straight road, and it has never been one. It is a road of returns, where investigators go back to the beginning, back to the highway, back to the book bag, back to the same questions, and back to the hope that someone may finally speak. Returning is not failure. It is the shape of persistence. Persistence is quieter than determination sounds in speeches. It looks like opening a file after lunch, comparing two reports, calling a retired officer, checking a property record, reading an old transcript, or answering a tip that may lead nowhere. It looks like a family attending another event with photographs they have carried for years. It looks like a community member pausing over a news story and deciding to search memory rather than scroll past. Persistence is made from small acts. Small acts kept this case from disappearing into the archive of forgotten names. They kept it present through changing media, changing investigators, changing technology, and changing generations. Each act may have seemed insufficient by itself, because none of them solved the case alone, but together they maintained the possibility of resolution. Possibility is not the same as certainty, but in cold casework it is precious. It is the space where tomorrow can still enter. Tomorrow, in a case like this, may come through science or speech. It may come through a laboratory report that gives investigators a name to examine, or through a person who finally tells what they saw, heard, owned, moved, or feared. It may come through a document that connects a vehicle to a route, or through an object recognized after a public appeal is seen again. No one can predict the form of such a turn. The responsibility is to be ready for whichever form it takes. Readiness includes keeping the story accurate. Asha was 9. The morning was the 14th of February, 2000. The place was near Shelby in Cleveland County, and the route centered on North Carolina Highway 18. Her book bag was found more than a year later near Morganton, wrapped and hidden, and investigators later asked about a specific old green vehicle and unfamiliar items found with the bag. These facts should be held plainly, without exaggeration and without careless simplification. Plain facts are the anchors. Anchors keep the retelling from drifting. Without them, the case can become a fog of theories, emotional impressions, and repeated phrases that slowly detach from the evidence. With them, the listener can understand why the case became so difficult and why the difficulty did not end the search. The facts show a child's unexplained departure, brief public sightings, scattered physical traces, delayed evidence, and long-term investigative persistence. That is enough to understand the coldness. It is also enough to understand the care. Care does not solve cases by itself, but it creates the conditions in which solving remains possible. It keeps family voices from being drowned out by speculation, keeps evidence protected from neglect, and keeps public memory from fading into indifference. The Asha Degree case has been held by CARE for more than 20 years, and that is one reason it continues to receive attention despite the passing calendar. The unanswered facts are still there. The people who want answers are still there. In the quiet of this long retelling, perhaps the most important thing is to let those two realities remain side by side. The facts are unanswered and the care is ongoing. The trail cooled and the search persisted. The evidence was incomplete and the file stayed open. These are not contradictions, but the actual shape of many old investigations where people continue working in the space between what can be proven and what must still be found. That space is difficult, but it is not empty. It contains the road which still runs beneath ordinary traffic. It contains the family home, remembered now through the lens of that morning. It contains the school and church and basketball court, not as clues alone, but as parts of the life Asha lived before she was missing. It contains the book bag, the objects, the vehicle description, the searchers, the investigators, and the annual calls for information. It contains a community that is aged around the same unanswered question. The question remains because it has not yet been met by enough evidence. That may sound stark, but it is also the clearest way to say why the case went cold. The investigation did not lack importance, and it did not lack emotion. It lacked the recoverable link that could turn movement into explanation, explanation into identification, and identification into proof. Until that link appears, every careful person must keep saying what is true and no more. Truthfulness is its own kind of vigil. And in that vigil, there is room for gentleness. There is room to remember that the people in the case are not characters, but human beings who lived ordinary lives before one morning made them public. There is room to let the story move slowly, because rushing would not honor the years already spent waiting. There is room to speak of investigators not as heroes in a drama, but as people doing hard, quiet work with imperfect tools and enduring responsibility. There is room to let unanswered questions rest without becoming forgotten. The file is still open, and that openness carries both ache and possibility. It means the old morning has not been fully explained, but it also means no official finality has sealed the questions away. It means the evidence still has value, the tips still matter, and the public can still help by remembering accurately and speaking honestly. It means that even after many years, the case remains capable of movement. Quietly, patiently, and without drama, it remains waiting.